James chapter 3, the first half of chapter 3. Now, we're in the middle of the book of James, and this series is Wisdom for Hypocrites, which means that the focus of the book of James is about hypocrisy, a lack of consistency. And we've seen that it's been some tough medicine so far. James sort of putting his finger on how we are inconsistent, the way in which our faith doesn't match our actions. And so it's been tough in that sense because it's highlighting things about ourselves that we're uncomfortable with, that we don't want to face up to. And today, it's as though James, and he's talked about favoritism, and he's talked about other aspects of our actions, other aspects of our lives where we may not be consistent. And today he's focusing in on words, because words, as we'll shortly discover and explore, words are powerful and important, and sadly are often a place in which we are hypocrites, often a place in which we're not consistent, a place in which our faith doesn't match our deeds. So let's take a look at what James has to say, and we're going to see that alongside the tough medicine, and medicine's often, it's unpleasant, and maybe it's masked by some flavouring, but when you take it, it doesn't taste very nice, but it's good for you. And so it's going to be a bit of that today in the book of James, but hopefully you'll be able to see both as we look at this, as we focus on words. So let me start with this illustration. You may have heard these words before. American school kids would be very familiar with it, not where even in an Australian context, not as familiar with these words, but I bet you've heard them before. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So as you probably guessed, that's one of the first sentences of the Declaration of Independence. So that was written in the late 1700s by the American colonists when they fought the Revolutionary War, to separate themselves out from England and King George. Now, it's kind of appropriate, I think, to open with this illustration for a number of reasons. Firstly, because with the American election approaching, it feels as though the American experiment based, which begins with these words, more on that in just a sec, it feels as though it's kind of coming to an end. Because what these words did was they launched an experiment in democracy, an experiment in culture, an experiment in civilization. And the way in which this experiment started was with words. These words expressed powerful ideas, they communicated powerful ideas, and then they were these words and the ideas that they carried with them were communicated. And so if you're in an American school, you'd be familiar with these words, you say them, you learn them. And so this particular piece of prose, this particular document, becomes really powerful and significant. And there's other similar documents. For example, the Magna Carta, many hundreds of years before this, kind of set the scene for the Declaration of Independence. But the same sort of idea, a document that changed the course of civilization, that set in motion a powerful, positive experiment where democracy and freedom and liberty and individual happiness was prioritised. And these ideas were all contained in words. They needed words to be expressed, and they needed words to put them into action. And words are a type of action. You might have heard that horrible schoolyard phrase, that idiom, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. It's as though sticks and stones are real, and they'll do real damage, true, but words won't. But I think as we're going to see from James today, words do damage. Words are significant. Words are powerful. And what that little schoolyard idiom fails to recognise is that words are a type of action. They're just a different type of action. And that's what I want to look at, and that's what James wants to show us today. So the question that this chapter is answering, the question that James chapter 3 is looking at, the first half of James 3, is which words are you using? Which words am I using? Which words are you using? And I've got 3 headings. Communicating ideas, communing together, and creating a culture. So which words are you using? What words are you using? And you could add, how are you using your words? Are they communicating ideas, communing together, and creating a culture? So let's take a look at the first heading. Communicating ideas. Words communicate ideas. So I want you to think about the words you use under this first heading. And James says in verse 1, he says, not many of you should presume to be teachers, my brothers, because you know that we who teach will be judged more strictly. So right off the bat, James wants us to understand that there's a particular warning for preachers, myself, for professors and authors. And this particular warning that James gives, there's also a general warning for you all. And I'll get to that in a moment. But James gives this warning. He starts with this warning. He starts talking about words because the first thing he wants to say is that words communicate ideas. And they do this in 2 ways. Words carry ideas. So the content of words. If you think about the way in which urban legends, old wives' tales, or the modern form memes on social media, you think about the way names, you think about the way stories, think about marketing, think about scholarly articles, think about novels, think about podcasts, all use words to communicate, to carry ideas from the author, from the creator to you. Now, there's exceptions, of course. So visual art, maths proofs, music and kinesthetic type of things can carry unspoken, unverbalized, unwritten ideas. But if you were to talk about the ideas in maths or music or kinesthetic ideas, you'd need to use words to talk about the ideas that those things carry. And they're exceptions, but they're interesting exceptions because overall, whatever we're doing, whatever our context, whether we're children or grown-ups, in our professional context, in our personal context, we're using words to carry something, to communicate something from me to you. But words don't just carry ideas, words express ideas. So you might have heard of that phrase from Marshall McLuhan, the medium is the message. So if you think about the way in which poetry sounds and makes you feel differently than the way in which prose is structured and the way in which prose makes you feel. Now, of course, there's those boundaries between the two can be blurred in interesting ways, but nonetheless, the point remains that the lyrics of a song are shaped in a particular way, or the words you use create a particular emotional effect. Think about the way in which casual speech makes you feel, or the way in which you use speech casually. Compare that to the way in which I've crafted and using my words for this sermon, or the way in which you might use words in a professional context, or interestingly, as I used in my sermon last week, the way in which words are used in a political context. So it's not just the way in which words carry an idea from me to you, it's the way in which I shape words. It's the form of the words that I use. Let me illustrate with a bad example, with a really sad and sobering example of what I'm talking about, the way in which the words carry ideas, both the content and the form of words. Sorry to use this example. Well, it's because it's from a sad part of history, but I think it's an important example because words, as James is going to show us, can be used horribly and for evil purposes. So during World War II, in 1942, there was the Wannsee Conference. And this conference took place in a suburb of Berlin. It only lasted for about 90 minutes and it contained a variety of mid-level Nazi functionaries. Now, already the Nazi government had been persecuting and killing a variety of minority groups, including the Jewish people. But at this particular conference, they turned that unofficial, widespread activity into an official policy, and then that was put into motion in the death camps. And at this conference, this Wannsee conference, a memo out of that conference written by the head of the SS used that infamous phrase that we've come to associate with the Holocaust, with the Nazi death camps. And this memo, arising from that conference, the Wannsee conference, used the phrase, the final solution of the Jewish question. Now, what's interesting about that phrase is its form is banal, yet its content is evil. And we know particularly in hindsight, we know particularly from history, how evil the content of that phrase is. Yet the bureaucrats, the Nazi bureaucrats who were there, they weren't the top leaders, they were putting the program of the top leaders, Hitler and all his cronies, they were putting their plan into practice. This was a sort of mid-level, middle management conference to formalise and turn what had been happening more widely into an official, organised program. And it's interesting because that phrase is both bureaucratic and banal, but it also contains an evil idea. That's the way words work. That's why words are so significant. That's why James wants to focus on words, because words do that. And you need to see the way in which words communicate ideas. Which brings me to the application. There's the very particular specific warning for people like myself, for people that communicate the ideas of Scripture to you. Because we're seeking to dig up these ideas and communicate them to you, and they're recorded on the internet, and you can watch them on YouTube and discuss them afterwards. They have an impact. And so I need to make sure that they're true and delivered appropriately. But there's also a general application if you're a servant of Jesus, to use that description from verse 1 of James chapter 1. If you're a servant of Jesus, like James says, if you're a servant of Jesus, then you need to have an awareness of the way in which your words carry ideas, the way in which your words, either casually or formally, communicate ideas. And their form, not just the content, but their form also matters. So there's a specific warning for myself and a general warning for you. And let's take a look at the second heading, communing together. Words help or hinder us commune together. In other words, words can build you up or break you down. Take a look at verse 5. Likewise, the tongue is a small part of the body, but it makes great boasts. Consider what a great forest is set on fire, a world of evil among the parts of body. It corrupts the whole person, sets the whole course of his life on fire, and is set and itself is set on fire by hell. So a bad word, a word that breaks you down is connected, says James, to the fires of hell. So words don't just communicate ideas, words break relationships or build relationships up. Because I want us to see, this is a really potent negative example that James is giving, but I want us to see the positive corollary as well. So if I can just illustrate the positive, you've probably either read or seen the film Charlotte's Web, a delightful little story about some animals in a barnyard, and the pig Wilbur is, I think he's going to be, the farmer's going to take him off to market and he's going to come to a bad end. And Charlotte the spider, to encourage him to raise his spirits and to come up with a plan to save him, writes words in her web. Charlotte the spider writes words in her web. And these words are a key part of the plot. They create the plan of the animals to save Wilbur. They encourage Wilbur. These words are that Charlotte weaves into her web build up a web of relationships, just to push that metaphor out a little bit. Because to use that metaphor in that way, relationships are dynamic. They're not transactional. It's not, sometimes they are at a basic sort of level. You have your car serviced, and so you pay money to the person to service your car. But relationships are often so much more than transactional. It's not just I do this for you and you do this for me. There's a web. It's probably the best way to describe it. And sometimes webs are strong or weakened. They can be built up. They can be stretched. They can be broken. And relationships are a core part of who we are as individuals. We're individuals inside a group, and the group is held together. The group is a web of connections. One member of our congregation studies the connections and the networks between people. And it's so crucial to realise, and James wants us to realise, well, he focuses on the negative, but it's also worth emphasising the positive, that words break down or build up with massive consequences. By building up, I mean that there's a way in which even your small talk and your deeper questions about life, meaning in the universe can nourish a relationship in really positive and powerful ways. Think of small talk as sort of tuning into someone. Think of asking questions about life, meaning in the universe as going on a journey with someone. There's an amazing potential for words to do the opposite of James's example here, to build up. Which means, though, there's also the danger of words breaking relationships down. And it's worth emphasising here that words both which are calculated to harm and words which casually harm hurt that web of relationships. Now, whether it's casual words that harm or whether it's words that are designed to harm, and context will tell you which type you're dealing with, are often downstream from other sins. And this is why James talks about hell, see in verse 6, and is itself set on fire by hell. And James links the way in which words can break down a relationship, either casually or deliberately, and more on that in just a moment. But James links this to hell because, to go back one step, judgment is God giving people over to the evil that they've chosen. C.S. Lewis talks about, in The Great Divorce, someone who grumbles becomes a grumble. He's consumed by this particular sin. God gives him over to that sin. This is why James links the boasting of the tongue to breaking down the fabric of relationships. Because the more you break down relationships, the more you destroy the fabric of the web that links people to one another. And so you start to destroy what it means to be a person living among other people. And eventually, the more you break that down, if you choose that, then God will give you over to that choice, like with other sins. But James is particularly focusing on the way in which words do that, and words can do that in that relational context. That's why James links it back to hell. Now, so I want to suggest one little tool that will help you navigate the way in which words can break relationships down, damage the web between the webs between people. And we can talk about this little tool in the question time. And the tool is scale. You know, a ruler or a measuring cup in the kitchen. I want you to think about the scale of the harmful words, of the words that are breaking down a relationship. Because that'll help you kind of weigh them up. Because the danger is to become very sensitive and to always kind of be very positive and kind of hide the negative and avoid conflict. That's not what James is saying. James is saying, as you speak, be aware that if you, in the context that you're in, if you choose words that break down relationships, that has a consequence. So it's scale. Scale is the tool in which we determine, well, is this something worth getting bent out of shape about, or is this something worth pursuing? So think about it, is what is the context in which these words are said? So, for example, the words that I'm saying to you now, hopefully they're building you up, and I need to be aware of them and choose them carefully because the scale of this is greater than the question time. The question time isn't recorded. The question time is more intimate. And so you need to kind of use scale to measure the potency of the words, the potency of their building up and the potency of their breaking down. And there's a lot more that can be said and explored in that, but I think that helps us keep things in proportion, helps us not blow things out of proportion. You said a bad thing to me on the phone 2 years ago when you were really upset. Kind of keeps that in proportion to, well, why did you write that letter? Or why did you, in my performance review, say those words? You see the scale, and you could perhaps use context. But I want that to stick in your brain, is to use scale, is to measure the words, measure the building up and the breaking down in that way. Which brings us to our last point. Creating a culture. Words create a culture. When you use your words, do you realize this? Not just the relational building up or breaking down, not just the carrying of ideas, but they create a culture. Why do I say that? Verse 10. Out of the same mouth comes praise and cursing. My brothers, this should not be. Can both fresh water and salt water flow from the same spring? My brothers, can a fig tree bear olives or a grapevine bear figs? Neither can a salt spring produce fresh water. In other words, what James is describing here is when you look at a group of Christians, and it can be extrapolated out into society, a family, a workplace. What is the subculture? What is the expectations, assumptions, history of that group of people? How would you describe, how would you look at and think about that web of relationships? And words are the way in which a subculture is created and continued. And if you think about the negatives to this, say you join a group and there's gossip going on and even worse, slanders taking place. Perhaps there's spin from the pulpit or from the leadership position, and there's people giving lip service but then behaving in a different way. There's a problem, because how can those things coexist with good behaviours or good words? James is saying a subculture that contains those things is rotten, is a problem, is broken, it's corrupt, and a symptom that there's sins further upstream in those individuals, if that little subculture contains those things in it. Because when you join a group, thinking particularly a congregation of Christians, but then you could extrapolate this out into society, but focusing first on us gathering together. The question that should be answered in the affirmative is this a group of plodders? And the answer should be yes. I can see that, that guy's struggling with drunkenness, and that guy's struggling with swearing, and this person's, recovering from an affair, and this person over here is recovering from something else. But I can see that they're all plodding away from that sin and towards Jesus, instead of, as James warns against, everybody's giving lip service to some sort of high level of morality, but then their words, there's gossiping going on, and perhaps even worse, there's slander taking place. And James says you can't have that. If that's the subculture of a congregation of Christians, then there is genuine hypocrisy taking place. There is a problem. And so hopefully the answer to the question of, is this a group of plodders, is in the affirmative. Because remember from last week, the first step to dealing with hypocrisy is to admit that you have a problem and then to seek help. And it's not to say that there's going to be no perfect group of Christians, no perfect group anywhere in society. But if the subculture of that group is we're plodding towards Jesus and away from sin, then that is a stream that's only bearing fresh water. That's a fruit tree that's only bearing the correct type of fruit. That's a mouth that's only expressing consistently one thing. This is why at St. Kilda and Balaclava, our slogan is sharing the meaning and grace we find in Jesus. We want both the discussion of ideas and loving relationships. We want to be a group that has a subculture where we can talk about life, meaning, and the universe really deeply and ask all the questions, the difficult questions, the provocative questions, the controversial questions, the deep questions, the repetitive questions. But at the same time, we also want to be building up the relationship, that web of love between us, meaning and grace, so that we don't fall into this trap that James is warning against. We're not a spring that is trying to be lukewarm, but trying to have salt water and fresh water. So in a way, to finish this point and to apply it, you can be thinking about the way in which your words contribute to our little subculture. Now that can be both casually in small talk, you're tuning into someone, or it can be the more technical, theological, philosophical questions. Either way, and hopefully both, is you're building up a subculture that isn't like the one that James warns against here. So let me tie it all together, or bring it back let me bring it back to the original illustration that I opened with. When the Declaration of Independence was written down, they needed to put these words into practice. So they put these words containing these ideas expressed in this particular way, they actioned them with this resolution. So when the Congress met, they used words to turn these other words into an action with words. And they resolved that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. Can I encourage myself to join in that declaration, to make that political declaration a personal spiritual declaration? Not that I'm, trying to say that the British monarchy is is sin or evil, but to kind of repurpose that declaration for yourself spiritually. I want to declare myself separate from sin. I want to be a spring that only bears fresh water, a grapevine that only bears grapes. I want to be consistent. So join with me in praying. Heavenly Father, thank you for the book of James. Thank you for his encouragement to be consistent. Thank you for his warnings about words. Thank you for the way in which he helps us think about the dangerous power of words, the way in which they can harm relationships. So help us communicate ideas that are true, build each other up, give us the wisdom to do that wisely, even in the midst of disagreement. And Lord, please may we be consistent plodders towards your Son Jesus and away from sin. In Jesus' name, amen.